Thank you for coming. My name is Molly Gill. I'm the Director of Federal Legislative Affairs for Families Against Mandatory Minimums, FAM. We're very pleased to co-host this event with the American Conservative Union Foundation. We're very excited today to be presenting a new report that we just issued looking at what kinds of programming and jobs and education are available in federal prisons. If you want to read the full details of what we found, I encourage you to pick up one of these good-looking reports that are on the desk in the hallway. It's also available online at fam.org/prisonreform. But we're going to kick it off with a brief video that summarizes what the report finds. So, Rabia, kick it away.
Everyone is safer if we make sure people come out of prison better than they went in. FAM asked more than 2,000 federal prisoners what kinds of jobs, education, and vocational training and drug and mental health treatment they had access to. Results show we have a lot of improvements to make. Most prisoners have jobs, but more than half of these jobs exist to just keep the prison running. Vocational training is popular but limited, and not always taught by qualified professionals and offered only to people close to their release dates. Education reduces recidivism, but most prison classes are more recreational than educational, and most classes are taught by other prisoners, not education professionals. College programs are scarce and unaffordable, and only 3% of prisoners said they have computer access to help them complete college and learn technology. 2/3 of prisoners said they had a drug or alcohol addiction. Fortunately, those who took the prison's residential drug abuse program, the RDAP, found it helpful. But there are long wait lists for RDAP, partly because it offers such an enticing incentive, a 1-year sentence reduction. Prisoners who participated in faith-based programs said they were helpful, but more mental health and behavioral counseling is sorely needed in prisons. Family support is vital for a successful reentry, but almost half of prisoners are housed too far from their families, making it difficult and costly to get visits from spouses and children. Reentry itself is daunting for prisoners, many of whom said they were afraid of having to spend time at a halfway house that may be unsafe, expensive, and far from their families. Prisoners need better jobs, more vocational training and education, more drug treatment and mental health counseling, incentives to participate, and qualified staff to provide services. This will require action and money from Congress, but the investment pays for itself by reducing recidivism and making everyone safer.
Well, what you just saw is a lot of statistics and data, but now we're going to share some personal stories, and we're very fortunate today to have a panel that of experts in the sense that they have personally experienced what we're going to be talking about. 4 of our 5 panelists today have spent time in federal prisons, some a very long period of time, some a shorter period of time, and all at different security levels. And they have different stories and experiences that they're going to share with us today. So we're very pleased to have David Safavian with the American Conservative Union Foundation here with us. We have Sean Hopwood, who served some time for a bank robbery and is now going to be a law professor at Georgetown University Law Center. We have Kevin Ring, who is the president of FAM. We have Norm Brown, who spent 24.5 years in federal prison for a nonviolent drug offense and is now running a reentry program called Project New Opportunity. And we have Nancy Levine, who has one of the most impressive biographies I've ever seen because she's been doing research on prison reform, sentencing reform, corrections, crime for many, many years, 20 years at least. So we're very pleased to have Nancy. Nancy also recently helped coordinate the Charles Colson Task Force on Federal Corrections, which was authorized by Congress and did research for a year and put out a great report about that in January 2016, which you can find at the Urban Institute's website, which is where Nancy hails from. So I do encourage you to read the panelist bios. I'm giving you a very brief overview because we want to jump into the program as quickly as we can. I should also say that we're expecting two special guests today, Congressman Bobby Scott and Senator Mike Lee. I'm told that they are on their way and hopefully will be joining us and share their thoughts. Both of them have worked very hard on this issue. So we're going to have a more informal conversation, and I'm going to turn it over to Kevin to moderate this panel.
Thank you for coming. As Molly said, we just want to have a discussion with people who not only are experts in the field and working towards reform, but actually have some personal experience, except for Nancy. I don't want to keep lumping her into this august group of former prisoners. I'm going to start with Sean. We're going to have a discussion about things that they saw and experienced through their time, how it relates to our findings in the report, and then Nancy will talk about how these report findings relate to the Colson Task Force, and then we want to get to questions and comments so we can have some more interaction. So I'm going to begin with Sean Hopwood. Sean, you served time for an armed robbery offense in, I believe, medium security facility, and we found a lot in this report about educational opportunities, and mostly found that there were not a lot of educational opportunities. And I want to ask you, what was your experience like, and what can you share that's relevant to that topic?
Well, education is the big equalizer because people that come out of prison having some post-secondary education, it's been proven that they are least likely to recidivate. And so education is very important. The problem is there just aren't a lot of educational opportunities in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And even when they are, those avenues can close down. I'll give you a story. The federal prison I was at, they had a really wonderful welding program. Friends of mine joined this program. They completed it. They learned how to weld. When they got out of prison, they were able to secure welding jobs paying $20, $25 an hour, which for a former prisoner is a really good paying job. The problem was we got a new warden in, and the new warden discovered that he could get more money if he switched programs. And so he took the welding program out of the prison and replaced it with an associate's degree program in business management, because everyone knows that the people coming out of prison, there's just loads of people looking to hire them to manage and run and operate their business. It didn't seem like a very good fit given where we were, but that's kind of some of the rationalizing that goes on in federal prisons. I was able to secure education both because I had been in the military and had a GI Bill and was able to take correspondence classes from universities all over the country. But that was not a part of any prison program. I had to do that on my own. Most of the prison educational programs are taught by other prisoners. I taught a class on legal research and writing. But there just aren't a lot of opportunities for people to get education and get job skills. And then we warehouse them in federal prison for often quite long, and then we kick them out to the free world and expect a miracle to happen. And that's why we need to really increase educational opportunities and job training for people that come into prison, because they're less likely to commit new offenses when they get out if we do that.
Thanks. David Svavian. First, thanks for co-hosting this event. I'm glad American Conservative Union is involved in showing people that justice reform is a conservative issue. You served time as well. Talk about some other things that stuck out to you from the report, maybe focusing on family ties and family connections.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Thanks for hosting or co-hosting with us. I'm having a little PTSD. The last time I had a microphone in front of me, I was on a witness stand. So first of all, let me just echo what Sean said. I was in what we lovingly referred to as Camp Cupcake, a very low security facility with folks that were a couple of years from the door, if not less. And that should have been the time when we really started to see reentry programming kick into high gear. And unfortunately, we saw everything but. Very little programming that was designed to get people ready to go, very little employment or vocational programming. And the classes that were available, to give an example, not unlike one that I saw in the FAM report, was a history class where people got to sit around and watch the History Channel for an hour a day. Not really designed to help people get ready to get back into society and become earners and participants. The other part that I saw that really was bothersome, not just for my subjective reality, but should be for everybody, is that the single most important factor in recidivism is going to be family ties, right? How close you are to your significant other, your spouse, your children. And it almost seemed like BOP went out of its way to make those ties more fragile. The best example I can give is my own, which is I live in Alexandria, Virginia, and they somehow found a facility 483 miles from my residence of record. I was up in Massachusetts, which doesn't sound too terrible, except when your spouse is a working spouse and has 2 children at home, one under the age of 1. It makes it pretty hard to get up there and come and visit. Now, for me, that was kind of a blessing in disguise because I didn't really want them to see me like that. But for guys who were really finishing long sentences and were trying to keep those or re-energize those family ties, they made it incredibly difficult. And that's a real problem because they come out and now they're not only dealing with the effects of prison and the Scarlet F for felon that makes it so much less likely for them to even get a job interview, more or less a job. They're also trying to rebuild those supportive relationships and relationships of trust. And it seems to me that if anything, BOP should be taking the opposite direction and trying to encourage those relationships, trying to build them up. And that's something that was just an abject failure in my eyes.
So we're very happy to have Senator Mike Lee from the great state of Utah here with us. Senator Lee has been championing prison reform and sentencing reform for many years now in Congress. And Senator Lee, thank you for being here today. We look forward to hearing what you have to share with us.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. And thank you to Families Against Mandatory Minimums. This is an organization that does so much good in promoting an awareness of issues that need to be addressed. I know you've got a busy program and you've got a lot of people to hear from. So I'm going to do something that's out of character and something that many consider impossible for a U.S. Senator. I'm going to step up to a microphone, look out over the audience, and then be brief. A couple of years ago, I gave a speech in which I made the conservative case for criminal justice reform. I explained that criminal justice reform is itself something that conservatives ought to be undertaking. I'm frequently asked the question, how can you be a conservative and yet be for criminal justice reform? Well, there's nothing in conflict about it. In fact, I must be for criminal justice reform because I am a conservative. Everything about it speaks of conservatism. We've seen that there's a lot of work to be done. So let me recap some of what I said a couple of years ago in that speech in which I made the conservative case for this issue. Criminal justice reform is all about strengthening communities and all about strengthening families. It's all about recognizing that when we lock people up for years, sometimes decades at a time, we send away people who are somebody's son or brother or uncle or father. We send away people who could otherwise be productive members of their communities and of their families. Criminal justice reform is also about recognizing equal dignity for all human beings, regardless of the fact that they may be flawed, regardless of the fact that they may have made mistakes. It's about the redemptive capacity for sinners. And it's about using very sparingly and very cautiously the overpowering and coercive force that is unique to government. These are issues that are at the heart of criminal justice reform, but they're also and especially at the heart of what it means to be a conservative, and they're why we need criminal justice reform. Most of the focus has been on sentencing reform, and that's absolutely vital. Prison reform, the topic of today's brief, is also very important. It's a key component of criminal justice reform. Conservatives believe that the family is the most mediating institution and the most important of the mediating institutions. the most important institution of civil society that we can. Yet, we have a prison system that far too often, as you were saying, David, far too often takes prisoners far away from their family, making it very difficult or impossible for them to visit, and difficult for them, in many instances, even to communicate electronically. Conservatives believe that the more intact you are, more connected you are with your family, and the busy you are in trying to provide a living for your family, the less likely you are to break the law. And so, as a result of that, we need to make sure that, number one, people eventually do get out of prison if they have, assuming they haven't done something that's going to cause them to be a perpetual threat to society, which most of the time they haven't. But it also means that when they do get out, they need to have certain skills. They need to have certain abilities that will enable them and prepare them to get a job and work to provide for their families. Conservatives do believe in redemption and in rehabilitation. It's part of why we as conservatives focus on due process, on individual rights, is that we believe in the dignity of the human soul. And so we believe that addiction treatment along the lines of what we see in long-term residential treatment centers, like Odyssey House in Salt Lake City, Utah, is crucial to reducing recidivism and thereby enhancing public safety and also the individual capacity of each human being who moves through our system. When you read FAM's report, you'll find recommendations on each of these topics. And I salute the work that FAM has done on this and commend each of you who have been involved in this effort. Thank you very much.
Sorry, if you'll bear with our microphones today. We had a few technical difficulties before we came into the room today, so we'll try to keep the microphones to a minimum here. So now I'm going to introduce Congressman Bobby Scott from this side of the Hill, from here in the House. And Congressman Scott has been a steadfast champion for prison and sentencing reform over the years. He's introduced some of the boldest legislation on this front, and we're very grateful to have him with us today. Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Molly, and I want to thank you and FAM for all the good work that you do on fighting mandatory minimums. You have a long history in that fight, and it's not easy. And that fight against mandatory minimums is essential today, more essential than it's been in the past, because we've got the Attorney General kind of going back into the old war against drugs, increasing the use of mandatory minimums by charging the most serious offense, which includes mandatory minimums. We've seen with the past president the effect of mandatory minimums. If you look at President Obama's commutation plan, where he was considering for commutation those who were low-level, nonviolent drug offenders who had already served 10 years, essentially first offenders, low-level, nonviolent, essentially first offenders who had already served 10 years, he would consider them for commutation. Well, that seems reasonable, but what ought to really strike you is, how did a low-level, nonviolent first offender get so much time that after 10 years they still need help? That's because the judge in imposing the sentence had no discretion but to impose a mandatory minimum sentence for low-level, nonviolent first offenders, giving them 15, 20, 25 years life without any discretion, without being able to consider that, wait a minute, this is a low-level, nonviolent first offender. And so we need people to continue fighting against mandatory minimums. Now, it's important to continue that fight and make sure we make the case that mandatory minimums are always reprehensible and ought to be eliminated from the code, because at some point they'll require a judge to impose sentences that don't make sense. And we've seen the research on it. Research has shown that mandatory minimums do not reduce crime. They discriminate against minorities. They waste the taxpayers' money. And then again, require judges frequently to impose sentences that are so bizarre that they violate common sense. And yet people, because they're poll tested and sound like they're tough on crime, people want to vote for them. When you start supporting some mandatory minimums and not others, you so confuse the issue that it's no longer a mandatory minimum of which criminals who've just been convicted ought to be seriously punished, and we're always going to be on the short end of that debate. To show what has happened just in the past few weeks, the House has passed several bills with mandatory minimums in it, and many people who should have been against all mandatory minimums in making that case were a little fuzzy, and that enabled those who like mandatory minimums for their political effect to win the day. It passed with overwhelming margin, sometimes just a handful of us voting against mandatory minimums. But it's important to have this fight because it is part of making sure that we have sentences that fit and we have a criminal justice system that makes sense. Senator Lee just left, very conservative. We have a bipartisan idea that criminal justice reform makes sense. We spend a lot of money on it. We have situations like the mandatory minimums that we know don't make sense. And Texas, I think, set up the situation where a bipartisan coalition would make sense. When they were looking at a $2 billion price tag on what they would need to spend in a couple of years to keep up with their codified slogans and sound bites that had loaded up the prisons to the point that they needed to spend about $2 billion in upcoming years to meet that demand. Somebody suggested, well, if you spend about 10% of that intelligently, prevention, early intervention, rehabilitation, you might not have to spend all $2 billion. And so, try anything, they tried it. And they looked up, not only did they not have to build any new prisons, they were able to close some of the prisons they had. And that creates a nice coalition. Some people like to reduce crime, others just like to save money. But we can all agree on that, and it's the same initiatives. And so as we go forward with that bipartisan coalition in reducing crime and saving money, using evidence and research and not slogans and sound bites as our guide, we can accomplish that goal. One of the main organizations fighting for that is obviously FAM. And I want to thank you again for that. We'll be reintroducing the Safe Justice Act in a few days to make sure that we have a vehicle to discuss evidence-based approach to reduce crime and save money. And we look forward to working with FAM and other organizations to finally get that bill passed. We have a lot of support, bipartisan, and with the support of the people in this room, I'm sure we can get it passed and make significant progress on criminal justice reform. Thank you.